Hey, welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Mideast News Hour. Guess what? I'm Carolyn Glick. I'm still here. Anyway, we're going to be plowing on again this week and discussing the nuclear negotiations that the Americans are carrying out with Iran, what the deal involves, what it doesn't involve, what it means, and how we're supposed to look at it in terms of both in comparison to the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, and also in the context of U.S.-Russian relations and the U.S. financial campaign against Russia and how that works with Russia being a major partner, and in fact, U.S. being dependent on Russia for the Iran nuclear deal that Biden and his people so desperately seek to achieve as quickly as possible. And I could think of nobody better to discuss these issues with than with my guest for today's show. Gabriel Noronha is a young man who we didn't know much about until about 2.5 weeks ago, when he posted a series of tweets on his Twitter accounts that were accounts that his colleagues in the State Department and who are in the U.S. delegation under Robert Malley in Vienna, and also I think representative members of a European delegation to the talks in Vienna had disclosed to him because they're so concerned about what was happening. So without further ado, I'm Gabriel. Thank you so much for joining me today on the show.
Thanks for having me, Carolyn. I appreciate coming on here.
Well, I think it's really important to talk to you. And before we start anything, let me just give everybody a little bit of your biography. So I'm just going to read out what you sent me. Gabriel Noronha is the executive director of 2 foreign policy initiatives in Washington. One is sort of a strategic communications strategy shop, and the other one is a little bit more audacious and ambitious, which is that he's trying to put together, it's a foreign policy initiative to try to coalesce Republican foreign policy minds to put together a coherent strategy that the party as a whole is going to be able to get behind. So I think that that's also a very important work. So we wish you all very good. We wish you very good luck in that endeavor as well. But I wanted to talk to you because during the Trump administration, you were special advisor to the Iran Action Group under Brian Hook. And you left the State Department in 2021. And you remain in contact with the professional State Department staff that remained behind and are on Malley's team in Vienna negotiating the nuclear deal that the Biden administration is so key to achieve. So can you tell us a little bit about the information you received and about the feelings of your colleagues that are on the U.S. delegation?
Sure. So I was reached out to by multiple members of the U.S. government who work on Iran because they were so concerned with the degree and the nature of the capitulations that were happening by Rob Malley in Vienna. And it's important to note that 3 members of the negotiating team had resigned in the last few months. 2 of those were political appointees. These weren't, conservative dissenters. These were, generally people supportive of the president's policy, but they
political appointees of President Biden.
The President Biden, as well as career officials who resigned. And that's on top of other career people who moved on from Iran or asked to be relocated elsewhere, just because they sort of said this whole policy doesn't make any sense. This is a giveaway. This policy is really just a disaster, and they didn't want to be part of it.
So it's interesting, Rich, before you start telling us about your colleagues who reached out to you, I mean, we should have to back up a second and say a couple of weeks before you reported what they were saying to you on Twitter, Richard Nephew, who was Malley's deputy as the deputy head of the U.S. delegation, he quit, along with, I think, 2 other State Department officials on the team. So your colleagues who spoke with you are just a continuation of that. By the way, how big is the U.S. delegation that Mali leads, or the team that Mali leads.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about size of personnel because that gets into sort of sensitive areas. But
are we talking about dozens? Are we talking about
I think
his
core negotiating team, I think, is a fairly small team. But there's a large apparatus in the U.S. government that works on Iran issues that is all supporting this negotiating team. Doing, from all the desk officers, all the, there's a large swath of the U.S. government that works on Iran because it's such an important national security issue.
And they're all subordinate to Rob Malley on this issue. Then he's the head of everybody.
Ultimately, the way the U.S. government generally works is that the special representative he might not have the final say, but he is the leading authoritative voice on the issue. So folks at the Department of Defense answer to the top generals, the top people at Treasury and NSC report to their leaders. But the special envoy for Iran sets the tone and sets the policy for Iran across the U.S. government, and basically is in the lead on all of this.
I see. So Malley, so even if they don't work directly for him, he's basically everybody's boss because he's the one who's making.
Yeah, he's calling the shots. Ultimately, above him, the Secretary of State does. But my understanding is that the Secretary of State is quite deferential to Rob Malley here.
So, okay, so what was it? So the people, though, that were speaking to you, the people who are ostensibly dealing with this issue or are dealing with this issue in the Biden administration, ostensibly want to make a deal with Iran. I mean, these are not opponents of the JCPOA. These are, like you said, some of them are even political appointees of Biden. So, but I mean, Richard Nephew was certainly for diplomacy with the Iranians when he joined the administration, when he joined the U.S. delegation under.
I think generally a lot of people in the U.S. government want a deal with Iran in theory, but the question is very much all about the details, and the details are what matter, and the details are what caused these career government officials to come to me and say this doesn't make any sense. These details and these concessions are far beyond the scope of the JCPOA. They're giving up even more than the JCPOA gave up. And they're getting less in return.
So let's talk about what the concessions that they outlined to you involve.
Sure. So the big one, and this would happen, is my understanding on sort of day one that the deal is reached and finalized, is it's the cessation of all sanctions under the Supreme Leader's Office executive order. This was an executive order that the Trump administration finalized in, I believe, June 2019 in response to the Iranians taking out a U.S. drone in the Strait of Hormuz and over international waters, and really as a response to their attacks against tons of maritime vessels in the area, just Iran's general conduct of terrorism. And we were able to sanction some of the regime's top terrorists and top human rights abusers and top torturers under this executive order. People like Ibrahim Raisi, who's involved in the execution of over 5,000 Iranians. People like Ahmad Janati, who again encouraged and took part in executing hundreds of political protesters. And then top terrorists like those who were involved in planning and executing the AMIA bombing in Argentina in 1994. Those and there's
the Marine barracks, right, in Beirut.
Yes, and RGC General Degan, who was instrumental in carrying out the bombing that killed 240 Americans and 58 French soldiers in Beirut in 1983. So these are some of the regime's most reprehensible figures. So those sanctions would all be lifted in the very early days of the deal, likely before the deal is even submitted to Congress, if that is being submitted at all. But those are bad, and each of those individuals deserves to be sanctioned. What troubles me perhaps more is the financial sanctions that are being lifted. Sanctions would be lifted on Iran's central bank, on Iran's National Development Fund, and on the economic drivers of terrorism, the entities that fund the IRGC, that fund basically all the proceeds that go to Hamas and Hezbollah, like the National Iranian Oil Company and National Iranian Tanker Company. These we know from both testimony of Iranian officials themselves as well as through other methods that these organizations directly fund terrorism, and that's why they were sanctioned under terrorism authorities by the U.S. government. Those sanctions would be lifted as well. And there's really
the Iranian National Oil, is that what you call the National Oil or National Petroleum Company? So the United States now is saying that they want, the minute that they conclude the Iran nuclear deal, the nuclear deal, that they expect for Iranian oil up to, what is it, 1 million barrels a day or something like that to come onto the market to lower oil prices. And so all of the money that goes to Iranian oil would be used to fund terrorism.
Yeah, roughly. So my understanding is the deal is actually in several stages. The stage that involves the oil sanctions would be one of the last stages of the sanctions relief. This could be a couple of months from now. And it's after some of the early actions by the Iranians and by our government have already proceeded. Then the sanctions relief on the oil comes off. Right now, Iran is exporting about 1 million barrels of oil per day. They would probably go back up. It would take some months for the production to resume, but they would go up to 2 to 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. That's an immense amount of oil revenue that gives the Iranians somewhere in the range of $50 billion of oil revenue per year.
Well, that's in current prices, right? I mean, I don't even know if that's in current prices because current prices rise, so quickly every day. It could end up being
that was under the old prices.
Right.
If you compare from the Trump administration levels of about 300 to 400,000 barrels of oil per day to going up to 2.5 million barrels at $100 a barrel, you're talking
130, yeah,
or 130. You're talking far more revenue.
All right. So that's a huge amount of money for Hamas. And who else gets funded from the oil company?
So we know that Hezbollah traditionally got $700 million a day, a year. Hamas got about 100 million.
Right.
Assad got huge lines of revenue, and Assad also just got oil as a driver of his war engine. The Houthis typically get weapons, but they also get some money, and then the Shia militias in Iraq, like AAH and KH, Kataib Hezbollah, they would get a large amount of financial support and military support as well from the Iranians.
So back to the sanctions withdrawal. So that you think that would happen 2 months into the deal? I mean, it seems to me like the Americans would be keen to have the sanctions off the oil as quickly as possible, right? Because of the crisis now in oil.
Yeah, I think part of it is a lot of this deal was being negotiated last year, and it's sort of, they didn't anticipate this oil spike coming. And as we'll discuss later with Russia, that's thrown a huge wrench into what is now suddenly a different geopolitical interests that countries are facing now that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really upended the geopolitical situation across the world. But yes, normally the U.S. would want oil sanctions lifted now, but now suddenly Russia does not want the oil sanctions lifted, which in my view is one of the reasons they're creating an impediment to this deal last minute all of a sudden.
All right. So what other sanctions are they talking about removing?
So they're also lifting sanctions on dozens of sort of the top facilitators of Iran's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile program. For example, Gavamine Bank, which is involved in financing the IRGC's ballistic missile programs. There's other banks which are involved in funding the Basij, which is Iran's sort of domestic root squad that killed 1,500 Iranians a year, 2.5 years ago.
And they were also instrumental in quelling the Green Revolution by murdering the protesters in 2009, 2010.
Absolutely. And then there's another 100, I believe 100 to 120.
But you said that those sanctions are supposed to remain on because the Iranians don't care because the Basij has nothing to do with the international financial.
So the Iranians didn't care about the Basij itself as an entity being delisted because there's really no financial transactions that it conducts with the rest of the world. What they care about are the financial mechanisms and the fundraising mechanisms for the Basij that allow it to have the funds to carry out its activities. That's the same reason that they wanted the IRGC to be delisted, because the IRGC has a huge financial interest and mechanisms around the world. And so that it was important for them that the IRGC have its sanctions removed so that they can conduct their terror funding.
Yeah. So, okay. So if the United States delists the IRGC from the list of foreign terrorist organizations the State Department publishes, what are the implications for the IRGC? What are the implications of being on the list? Just to get a clear sense, because the Trump administration, of course, listed them, and that was a huge move. And what did that take away from them?
So it allows the United States to take a huge amount of terror related sanctions related to the IRGC as a result. And so the way that sanctions work in the US government is if you can prove that you are providing terrorism support, financial or otherwise, that can then make you subject to sanction. So, the IRGC's financiers, they're the people that do business with them, can all be subject to terrorism sanctions. That affects both individuals and financial mechanisms and entities. So by delisting the IRGC, what you're doing is you're basically giving a free pass to all the networks and entities and individuals who are helping to fund and carry out and execute terrorism. Now, what the State Department is likely to say is that, we will continue to sanction individual terrorists. But the individuals themselves, it's one thing, but to actually stop the terrorism and actually create consequences, it's really about the networks, it's about the financial mechanisms, and it's about really sending a strong signal to countries around the world that say, hey, if you are doing business with the IRGC, you are liable as well. So it creates accountability. It creates an expectation around the world that, hey, if the United States, which is typically sort of the leader in identifying and terrorist organizations, says this is a terrorist organization, you're going to think twice about letting those individuals into your country.
So, but the question is, like, what kind of entities are you talking about? Are you talking about banks in, Germany? Are you talking about, who has been, how international are the IRGC's financial dealings? Are they spanning? Are they?
Yeah, they are quite significant. They span, across the Middle East. You have entities in UAE that have been involved. You have banks in China and companies in China and Singapore, in Thailand and Germany. You have some links in Latin America. So really, it's both an international business conglomerate and it's an international terrorist conglomerate.
Right.
And they're very enmeshed into the Iranian economy that way as well.
All right. So if they're delisted, then all of these players get to go right back to doing having economic cooperation, banking with them, being their investment advisors, whatever it happens to be, laundering money for them, without fear of being themselves placed under sanction.
I think that the devil is in the details there as well. So my sources indicated that Mali had offered to delist the IRGC, but my understanding is one of the final sticking points in the deal in the negotiations in Vienna is figuring out the exact mechanisms of how that would happen, what other entities would be delisted and unsanctioned as a result. So not every single detail there is ironed out yet, but I think we're very, very close to that being a possibility and finality.
Okay. Are there other financial sanctions that are going to be removed that we should also discuss before we go on to the nuclear issues?
I think the other big one is the Satad and the Bonyads Mostazafan. These are the Khamenei's personal slush funds, which have nearly or perhaps over $100 billion in wealth, that a lot of which was confiscated from Jews, from Baha'is, from other religious and ethnic minorities. And those entities would be delisted as well, which is a huge loss for anti-corruption fights, and as well as to put accountability on Khamenei himself.
I'm trying to remember, there was an article, a very big article that came out like 3 years ago. I should have looked it up before we started our conversation, but it was about how the I think it's Operation Cassandra, that the Obama administration stopped this major I think it was Treasury Department investigation of.
Yeah.
So can you just remind me of what that was about, and then talk about how this will enable that kind of operation to.
So, to the best of my recollection, it's been a little time since I've read that as well. But Project Cassandra was a joint Treasury and law enforcement operation against Hezbollah networks in Latin America and their links to the Middle East. It was looking at the financial mechanisms, but also the terror conduct and operations that they were looking to do. And they were at the verge of announcing final huge crackdowns on all these networks when the JCPOA was originally being negotiated. And they were told by the White House to stand down, that they were not to carry out their law enforcement function. They were not to carry out this, this operation, which was both law enforcement and anti-terrorism related, because they didn't want to upset Iran. And I think that's a really troubling pattern that we've seen from both the Obama administration and the Biden administration. I
agree with you. And, one of the large, and I'm sorry to our viewers and our listeners that what I'll try to do is link the Politico piece so that you can see exactly what it is that we're talking about. I should probably have reread it this afternoon, but be that as it may, it brings up the other party that the Biden administration is keen to get oil shipments from, which is Iran's Latin American ally, Venezuela. And Venezuela has been intimately involved with a lot of the corruption, the money laundering operations, of course, the uranium mining, the terrorist cells, and a whole bunch of other operations that Iran is carrying out with Venezuela in Latin America in striking distance of the United States. And how I guess that removing a lot of these sanctions against Iran will also redound to the benefit of the Maduro regime in Venezuela in certain ways, because they're partners.
And it's important to remember that Venezuela is hardly even a state anymore. It is really just a narco syndicate run by Maduro, who is a drug kingpin. That's what Venezuela it is. Wow. And so the idea that we're considering lifting sanctions on Venezuela as well is another travesty, but that's for another conversation, another day.
But Venezuela does have very close ties with Iran, which I think
they do, and there's both terror cooperation, oil cooperation. It's really an axis of evil, but an axis of convenience as well. They don't have ideological ties other than hatred and opposition of the West and America in particular.
Although there are some senior Iranians that are in the Venezuelan government. I mean, you also had a lot of the Tehran Express that was flying from, Tehran to Caracas and through Syria and Beirut on a weekly basis with various shipments. That was about 15 and 10 years ago. Anyway, so let's just move on though for a second to the nuclear details of the agreement that your colleagues divulged to you. It's very clear from what you wrote, and really just what we've seen, that this deal really is much weaker on the limitations on Iran's nuclear operations in the JCPOA. But can you give us some details specific to what you've learned from your colleagues about where they were in the 15 deal and where they are now in terms of the nuclear limitations?
So the big issue is, frankly, that they just haven't changed the details from the 2015 accord. Most of the restrictions in the JCPOA all sunset. Actually, all of them all sunset on Iran. Some of them have already done so, like the UN conventional arms embargo, which was codified in the UN resolution 2231. Right. But the nuclear restrictions themselves start expiring, I believe, just in 2024 on Iranian centrifuges, on both the sophistication and the quantity of Iranian centrifuges. By 2031, those restrictions all expire. Iran will have no limitation on the sophistication, the quantity, the quality, and they will have no limitations on both the enrichment level of uranium and the quantity. So they could, in theory, have as much enriched uranium for 100 nuclear weapons if they wanted to. Now, it's important, I always try to make the distinction. There's a difference between a nuclear enrichment breakout period, which is the time to get enough enriched material for a weapon, and the weaponization timeline. basically the ability to actually put a nuclear device together that can explode, and then separately to pair it with a ballistic missile for re-entry. Those are very different timelines. And I always caution that I think, in my personal view, they are equally important timelines, and there's been a huge emphasis by this administration to focus solely on the enrichment timeline. And that's the exact same thing that the Iranians want to focus on, because it's entirely used to extort the West. In my view, that is the principal function of Iran's nuclear program for the last few years, is generate very alarming headlines to try to extort the West into giving it sanctions relief, which is its primary goal.
Which is really so funny because, I saw that Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, God only knows how she keeps getting promoted. I mean, talking about failing up. But I mean, she was on all these Fox News shows today, and we're taping on Monday, and on Fox News Sunday. And she's saying, it would be terrible if Iran gets the nuke, and that's why we need to have this deal. And it was her brilliant plan in 1994 that gave us the agreed framework with the North Koreans. And the agreed framework of the North Koreans gave them sanctions relief for temporary abrogation or temporary cessation of the use of their Yongbyon plutonium reactor. And they just unsealed it and went back to developing plutonium-based nuclear weapons, and until when was it, in 2006 they conducted their first nuclear test. And so instead of being thrown out of Dodge and never listened to her again, she keeps getting promoted. She was a senior person. She was leading the talks for Obama, and now she's Deputy Secretary of State. And she's still up to her old tricks, and they've always failed, and she continues to do them, which really comes to a question of what are these people's intentions? I mean, is she stupid, or is she, she's fine with North Korea being a nuclear armed state? She's fine with Iran being a nuclear armed state? I mean, how do you read that?
I think your description I think is spot on. I was going to say very similar words myself. Look, I try not to impugn the personal motives of our leaders, because I don't know what's going through their heads, and I try to generally think the best of people. But what the word I would describe for both Ms. Sherman and Mr. Malley is the height of naivety. The idea
the height of what?
Of naivety.
Naivete.
That their principal mistake is thinking that our enemies think the same way that we do, and that our enemies can rely on good faith and can be trusted and have anything other than sort of maniacal ambitions. And so I think the other mistake that certainly Ms. Sherman made was this obsession with buying us a little bit more time, and which is really the better word for that is just kicking the can down the road. Look, for an individual, certainly for myself, 9 years or 10 years is a long time. In the life of a nation, and especially in the life of a regime which has patience, 9 years to get a nuclear weapon is just the blink of an eye. They are quite content to wait 9 years to get a nuclear weapon if that means that they can do so without the threat of sanctions. And if they have economic cover within those 9 years to acquire an S-400 or an S-500 anti-aircraft system from Russia so that they could deter a potential Israeli or US attack on their nuclear facilities. And so I think it's it's a bad bargain to seek a little bit more time of stability, and in that time to empower and enrich a country like Iran.
I think I don't know Wendy Sherman. I think that she's stupid she's dumber than a box of nails, as an old friend of mine who's a carpenter used to say. But I mean, she's really stupid. I don't actually think that Robert Malley is. I think that he's malicious. I think, I had Michael Duran on last week, and he and Tony Bedran wrote a very important article called The Realignment that was published in Tablet Magazine a few months ago. And I think that Robert Malley and Jake Sullivan want to realign U.S. Middle East policy away from Israel. They want to downgrade Israel. They want to downgrade the Saudis in the UAE, and they want to empower Iran because that's what they think is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do politically from a domestic perspective with progressives who who are very, anti-Israel and anti-Saudi. And it's the right thing to do from their strategic perspective, because I think that the United States is a force for ill in the world, and so are its allies, and that the way to make things stable or whatever or better is to empower America's enemies against America's allies, and for the United States to try to, get out of town.
That's a view that I believe, that is, in my view, the most faithful and accurate description of the core driving dynamics of the people in office today, especially Malley, Blinken, and Sherman, and to a lesser degree, Jake Sullivan.
Well, I don't know, Jake Sullivan, I think he has a Boy Scout look on his face, but when you look at his involvement in the Russiagate garbage, I think that it's hiding something else, but it doesn't really matter. You're right. Their intentions are much less important than what they're actually doing. And so just to go back to the nuclear thing, I think you're right. If you have limitations on the amount that Iran can enrich, but they end in 18 or 24 months, then who really cares? And anyway, I think there's another problem, which is the inspection regime. The inspection regime in the 2015 deal was a joke, because Iran could say that any installation they wanted to was a military installation, and therefore UN inspectors were barred from entering into them. So the toughest inspection regime we've ever seen, as John Kerry said, was not tough at all. It was ridiculous, because they get to say, oh no, this lady's bar, this lady's beauty shop is a military installation. You can't come in and see what we're hiding in our blow dryers. It was all it was a joke that they could say anything that they wanted to was a military installation. And now,
and I think it's to build off of what you're saying. I think it's important for viewers to remember that the IAEA themselves have said that the Iranians refused to provide them access to 2 nuclear sites in Iran for over 6 months, with zero accountability for what they were hiding within these sites, with zero answers for why they had refused to provide access. That is such a far cry from this 24 hours, anytime, anywhere inspection, which we were promised in the early days of the Iran negotiations. This administration will continually use the slogans like this, the greatest and strictest non-proliferation deal ever. Those are ridiculous slogans.
Unless you compare it with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for instance, of which Iran is a signatory, so that their entire nuclear operation, their entire nuclear program places them in material breach of their signature on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So if you were going to go, back to the world without a deal, then Iran should be required to abide by the limitations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which mean that they have to throw out their entire nuclear weapons program, which is what their program is. So, it's all a joke. It's all let's just close our eyes and say, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and it'll all be fine.
Exactly.
But so if you look at the limitations, so, are there explicit details regarding the inspections regime that are now being negotiated in Vienna that are different, or that about, that you can explain to us what's going to be happening with that?
I believe a lot of the details of the IAEA are actually still being negotiated as part of sort of the final agreement. The Europeans wanted a final resolution to the outstanding IAEA issues.
So those 2 sites that the Iranians wouldn't let the UN inspectors go into, is that what they're talking about?
Those are part of them. There's discovery of uranium metal, which is a part of the weaponization process at sites. There's a few other undisclosed issues which may have changed in the last couple of years from when I was at the State Department. And so those issues are still to be resolved. There's issue of camera access and camera memory storage at these sites. There's issues of harassment of IAEA staff. All these things still need to be resolved. What I believe is the case is that the IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, was basically forced and strong-armed into making a half-hearted agreement with Iran to appease negotiators who wanted this to no longer be an impediment. They wanted to get on with the deal. And Grossi sort of grudgingly complied with that. The other information which I've heard, I haven't had verified yet because it's, again, still in negotiation, is this idea of what is called an inherent guarantee. And what that means is Iran wants some form of assurance the United States will not pull out of an agreement in 1 year's time or 3 years' time with Republicans coming into Congress and the executive branch. And so what they're looking for is a mechanism by which they can keep both centrifuges and amounts of highly enriched uranium in country, so that if the US backs out of a deal, again, they can return the nuclear program exactly to where it is today.
Yeah, but what I don't understand about that, I saw your report on that. And the thing that I didn't understand about that is that the JCPOA is supposed to end most significant nuclear limitations on Iran in 2025. So if you assume, or if you take the Iranians' worst case scenario, which would be that the Republicans return to the White House and have control of both houses of the Congress, they still can't. I mean, it's not like they could get. It wouldn't matter if the United States wanted to vacate the New Deal because it would be over. So, so I couldn't quite understand.
All they want, what they want is to be able to. So there are certain restrictions which end in 2025. Certain restrictions end in 2027, others in 29, and then by 2031, all the meaningful restrictions are gone. The inherent guarantees, if the US pulled out in 2030 or 2031, it would have no effect. What it is basically a bridge for is 2025 to 2029. It allows those years to function for Iran like 2031 if the US withdrew. And so all it does is it's a little bit more insurance policy if the Republican president comes in.
But if the enriched uranium remains in Iran, then what have you done? I mean, if the centrifuges are in Iran, then what? It's exactly the North Korean deal, then, right? Because they just had to put seals on the Yongbyon facility, which they then unsealed when they were done with it, right? So
this, if you want to know why are career staffers leaving the negotiating team, why are political appointees resigning? It's directly because of concessions like this that simply don't make sense. There's no logic to them. There's no benefit to the United States. It's pure Iranian victories, which is why you had the Russian ambassador Mikhail Ulyanov say that Russia got far, far more than I expected, than others expected out of this deal. This is, again, it's Iranians kept asking and asking and asking for more things, and the US just kept giving them because they were so afraid that the Iranians would walk away from the negotiating table.
So the United States essentially, under Mali, it has absolutely no bottom line. It has no red line. It has no bottom red line. It has no lines that it's not willing to cross, which is why I find it sort of odd that they're jostling with the IAEA about inspections, because, say that Iran says, fine, we'll let you, we'll get, and in fact, there was a report that said that Iran, that they would conclude the deal now, and Iran would get their $90 billion out, right out of the starting block, but that they would get the IAEA its information by May, right? So they're already blowing them off. And obviously the Biden administration isn't going to go back and say, oh, wait, if they're not giving us the information, then it's all that, we want our money back. We're not going to take this anymore. All of the financial restrictions that we're on are that have just been removed are going to be reinstated. So, it's all kind of, who's the crowd that you think Mali is playing towards when he says, okay, yeah, we have to find out what's going to happen with the IAEA before we go forward?
Honestly, we're at the point now, and this is a sad point, where the European negotiators are taking a stronger line than the American negotiators are. You saw this in 2015. You had Gerald Duro, who's one of the most pro-Iran diplomats out there, still saying this deal that the Americans are doing is giving far too many concessions. And when you have something like that happening, that's a signal.
Yeah, the French were much more hardcore. Israel, Netanyahu was working with the French. The president was that Sarkozy then?
I believe it was Nicolas Sarkozy at the time.
Yeah, so Israel was working with the French against the Americans. during the Obama.
So to answer your question, what constituency is Mali even trying to appease right now?
It's the Europeans.
Very, very, very far left in the U.S. Mali was, when Mali's name was first floated.
No, I don't. No. I don't mean who he's trying. I'm saying if he's pretending to play tough guy, like backing the IAEA. When they said they have to iron out, the details of their inspections, when it's fairly clear that nobody's going to hold Iran to their word on the inspections after this deal is concluded, who is he playing to? Who is he trying to play the tough guy with?
It's mostly theater. And look, the Iranians know
that the theater is towards whom? It's towards the American public. Who is his target audience when he pretends to be a tough guy?
I think it's other bureaucrats within the U.S. government. I think it's the Europeans, and I think it is a sort of a show for a attempted show at the Iranians. But the Iranians aren't intimidated and aren't really impressed by this. So it's basically the bare minimum necessary to satisfy bureaucrats within the U.S. system to say that he is at least making some show of trying to uphold U.S. national non-proliferation goals.
Okay, now go back to what you were saying before, that about Mali and the progressives.
Well, Mali was one of the most progressive choices, and he's one of the most progressive political appointees in the whole U.S. government. Certainly, he's the most progressive in the foreign policy establishment. And
I don't know, he's got some stiff competition, but okay,
But he really is fringe. I mean, he was fired from President Obama's campaign in 2008 for his meetings with Hamas. That says a lot. To be clear, I'm not arguing that he is a member of Hamas or that he has provided material support, although if they provide $90 billion to Iran, it will effectively be providing material support to Hamas and Hezbollah. But I think you actually made a really great point. If they go back in this deal, they will have spent a year doing so. They will call it some form of crowning achievement. And if Iran then starts cheating tomorrow, I guarantee you that the United States will do nothing about it. We saw this for years with how the Russians cheated on the INF treaty. We saw this for years with the Chinese cheating on things. And we know the Iranians were violating their non-proliferation requirements by having an archive of nuclear material still locked up away in Tehran. So we know that they've done that, but this administration has this serial obsession with not confronting our enemies with violations of treaties, and they won't ever get out of them because there's this almost religious fanaticism with which they hold international agreements, and they believe that they're sacred because they personally were involved in negotiating them. And so
I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think there are arguments to be made on that are rational, but an international agreement that's being materially breached by one party is not an agreement. Exactly. That's the problem, is that it's not that an agreement is sacrosanct. It's that the obligations that the parties to the agreements take on, that's what's supposed to be maintained. That's what's supposed to be respected, not an agreement per se. It's the obligations. And if they're not carrying out the obligations, this just redounds to the basic irrationality of the policy, right? Because if you're saying, well, we need to protect the agreement when it's being undone by one side, then you're living in a fantasy. Your concepts are fantasy.
Which I think is exactly where the Europeans have lived for the last few years, where every month or so, every 2 months, they put out a statement saying they are concerned or condemn some Iranian nuclear development. And they have yet to put on a single consequence for these Iranian nuclear developments.
No, they scuttled them. And that's where I wanted to go next, actually. Yeah. So why don't we just shift for a second to the maximum pressure campaign? Because, it's true that, there are indications of discomfiture among the Europeans at Mali's radicalism, which is, like you said, incredibly ironic and silly, but it's alarming, not silly. But it's par for the course, or the reason why it's ironic is because of the way that they treated the Trump administration's Iran policies, and also Iranian breaches of the JCPOA. That they refused to implement the snapback sanctions when it was obvious that the Iranians were in fact in breach of the deal, and that the snapback sanctions were supposed to be required. And so they were shielding Iran from the Trump administration and working with Kerry and Malley and others from the Obama administration during the Trump presidency to undermine and subvert U.S. diplomacy and policy towards Iran. So can we just talk a little bit about what did the maximum pressure campaign that you were involved in, what did it set out to accomplish, and how was it doing when President Trump left office in January?
So the maximum pressure campaign had two goals. The first goal was to pressure Iran into coming back to the negotiating table, ostensibly to negotiate a actual longer and stronger deal that would constrain Iran's nuclear program more, curtail its support for terrorism and regional destabilization, curtail its ballistic missile program, and then resolve some hostage issues. That was one goal, which didn't work, and I'll explain for various reasons why I think that was the case. But the second goal, which was complementary and was sort of an equally good outcome, was simply to deprive the regime of revenue with which to carry out all of its nefarious foreign policy agenda, so its nuclear program, its terrorism, and everything else. On the second count, it was extraordinarily successful. We deprived the regime of about between, depending on your accounting, about $200 billion in revenue that it otherwise could have used to spend on terrorism, on its armed forces, on all those elements of national strength.
By the way, how much money did they get from sanctions relief from the JCPOA until the maximum pressure campaign was implemented?
When the JCPOA itself was signed, they got $56 billion in direct sanctions relief, so frozen assets that were unfrozen. And then they were able to sell as much oil as they wanted, up to about 2.6 million barrels of oil per day until 2018 when sanctions resumed. So if you combine that, probably around about $200 billion, give or take, that they were able to bring in. And then we took away over the course of our maximum pressure campaign, $200 billion.
Okay.
The results to this,
but that was in lost revenue, right? That wasn't
in both lost revenue and in assets that were frozen that they were unable to access.
Okay.
Combination of the two. So Iran's military spending decreased by 28% in 1 year, 21% another year. Now that does massive things. When you are unable to both procure new military equipment, pay salaries, Hamas was on austerity, Hezbollah had to lay off fighters left and right. The Houthis couldn't get nearly as many weapons. And so you saw what we were at the beginning of in 2019 and then 2020 was a radical transformation of the Middle East because the terror proxies were starving, basically. They just wouldn't have the money. And we were seeing Iran's economy shrink by 6-7% for 2 years in a row. And so we were seeing basically the stranglehold take place of Iran's economy. Then COVID came in, made it even worse. But we didn't get a deal. And here's why. Because Khamenei views a deal as a capitulation to the West and as the end to the Iranian regime and everything it stands for. Because the Iranian regime stands for conflict with West and conflict with Israel. That is the core nature of the regime. And so for them to sign that away is almost akin to the United States saying we will get rid of our constitution.
So wait, you guys thought there was an actual thought that the maximum pressure campaign would bring Iran to the negotiating table?
There was. I think we saw signs at first that they were considering it.
Are you talking about Brian Hook and
Yes.
and Mike Pompeo and
Hook, Pompeo, even Bolton, I think at times, we thought that there was a good chance that we could actually get Iran to negotiate. Now, within that, we believed that Iran was not willing to negotiate a deal that was going to meet any of, so we had 12 requirements. We sometimes thought that Iran would be willing to give up 2 or 3. We thought that somewhere maybe 7 to 10 would have been sufficient for us to say we'll agree to this deal. We didn't expect them to say yes to 12, but that's a negotiating give and take. But I think in Iran's calculus, and certainly in Khamenei's mind, it was actually when we imposed full oil sanctions on Iran that Khamenei turned and he said, they're not trying to negotiate. They are trying to destroy our regime. And they're doing it by strangling the economy, which is the beginning of destroying the regime. And
is that why you didn't? Is that why there was so much hesitation to putting those sanctions on the oil? And
actually, no. There was a lot of hesitation.
Or removing. There were sanctions waivers that kept getting renewed, and then they finally were not renewed. And that was one of the things that the Biden administration renewed. Right.
This is they have not renewed those sanctions waivers yet. There were three things. There was the listing the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. A lot of people thought that was going to trigger the Iranians into conflict with us. The Iranians cared about it, they yelled about it, but it wasn't part of their military strategy. When we put those sanctions on full sanctions on Iran's nuclear oil program and oil exports, that changed Iran. And I think, from my time there, that is perhaps the only time we failed to anticipate Iran's reaction properly. I don't think we properly understood how escalatory Iran viewed those oil sanctions. When we went into those oil sanctions, we were looking primarily for economic reasons. The only hesitation we had was we were afraid what it was going to do to the global oil price. We didn't think that it was going to cause Iran to set off and blow up ships across the Middle East and sort of go into this campaign of terror.
So did you guys think that it was, in retrospect, that was a mistake?
My view of it is we probably should have gone a little slower and eased into it, is probably my answer now. That we took Iran from 1.1 million barrels of oil per day exports. We took that down all the way to zero overnight, basically. And my view now today is that we probably should have allowed Iran to export, a few 100,000 barrels of oil, which is what they ended up doing anyways. What ended up happening was China ended up exporting. A bunch of countries sort of said, hey, we can't do this. We're still going to export and import Iranian oil anyways. And I think, and this is why I'm very hesitant on doing full oil and energy sanctions on Russia today, is based on my experience with these oil sanctions on Iran, on understanding just how difficult it was to take that much oil off the market and to try to enforce those global economic sanctions around the world. It's a lot of work. It is one of the most difficult things the U.S. government has ever endeavored to do in sort of an economic sanctions regime.
So one of the impacts of the shrinkage of the Iranian economy during the period of the maximum sanctions, maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration was that you had millions of Iranians all over the country who were going out in the street and calling for the toppling of the regime. When you guys were looking at this in Washington, I know that Secretary Pompeo did speak supportively of the Iranians who were opposing the regime, but you didn't see this as an opportunity to bring down the regime?
Regime change was never a goal of President Trump's. President Trump actually was rather explicit on a couple of occasions that he did not seek regime change in Iran. And I think that was very much colored by his experience of regime change in Iraq, as well as what we saw in the Arab Spring, that when you ask for something, you have to be very prepared for the full consequences of what that was. And so President Trump didn't support regime change. Now, I think one of the contradictions, there's a couple contradictions I'll freely admit. I think one contradiction we had was a policy that sought regime change in everything except its rhetoric. We never called for regime change. But I think if you understand the Iranian perspective, they thought that we were seeking regime change, and they saw our policies as being a policy of regime change in everything except saying we wanted regime change. We supported the people's what we've said is we always supported the Iranian people's goals and aspirations for a democratic Iran. We want the Iranian people to choose their destiny and choose their future leaders. It's not up to the United States. But we supported the Iranians taking to the streets and calling for a government that actually cared about their interests and didn't care primarily about supporting and fomenting terrorism around the world.
Like, I mean, I guess, I just, it's hard for me to get I know that this was President Trump's idea that he was going to get a better deal with the Iranians. Do you think that if he had had a second term that the Iranians would have come to the table and made a deal with President Trump?
I believe so. The wild card is Khamenei himself. I think Khamenei dug in, especially towards the end of 2019, and then especially after we took out Qasem Soleimani. After we took out Qasem Soleimani, for him it was he would rather go down dying with the regime than capitulate to the West.
So the subversion of the Democrats, the Democrats were meeting with Jawad Zarif and with other Iranian officials in European capitals and in other places, and telling them that they should just wait. They have to wait out the Trump administration because the Democrats would come back and they would reinstate the JCPOA. The Democratic Party in 2018, after President Trump announced that he was leaving the JCPOA, they passed a resolution, committing themselves to returning and restoring the JCPOA when they came back into office. What did you guys feel that those positions, that those actions by the likes of John Kerry were having any impact on U.S. relations with Iran, on the success of the maximum pressure campaign?
What it told
et cetera?
what it told the Iranians was they could wait until the end of 2020 and see if this could change.
And did that impact do you think that the Iranians bought it? That they thought that was a good idea?
I think so. I think now I don't want to say every single Iran. I think if you look at
the regime, I'm talking about the regime.
I think if you look at, I've always said the regime is not monolithic. You have certain characters like Zarif who said, let's wait this out. Let's wait until Democrats are back in office and we can wait this out. I think you have other officials who would have said, well, and this is what Khamenei has said himself publicly on many occasions, is I don't care if it's a Democrat, I don't care if it's a Republican, you can't trust them either way, and we're going to act the exact same way. So I believe that, but I don't think it helped. It only certainly hurt what we were trying to do, or hurt in the perception that the Iranians said, we have an out, all we have to do is wait Trump out. If you had the Democrats instead say, we will continue the exact same policy, I think you would have seen the Iranians say, okay, we've got to reach some form of accommodation with the West. We cannot continue down this road. I
see. What about military operations? I mean, there was the hit on Soleimani. Do you know what precipitated that? I mean, was there and the after effects of that, how it was viewed in the immediate aftermath of his death? Can you give us a little bit of sense to the decision making there? So
what we saw starting the summer of 2019 and then escalating, especially in the fall, was the Iranians taking more and more drastic measures against the United States. Started with attacking our drone, but then it started with rocket attacks against bases, and it kept escalating further and further. And it really culminated when the Iranian-backed militias attacked the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad on December, I believe, 29th. That was pretty bad, and there were indications that the Iranians were looking to do what they had done to the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, that they were looking to take hundreds, perhaps, of Americans hostage, perhaps kill many of them. And that led to a discussion of, we have to stop this Iranian mentality. And we knew that Qasem Soleimani was going around the Middle East, and we knew that he was planning devastating attacks against U.S. interests, which would have resulted in the deaths of, I think Secretary Pompeo said, could have resulted in deaths of hundreds of American civilians and service members. And so President Trump made the decision that we were going to change the calculus. And the way we changed the calculus was we showed Iran, if you want to play this game, we can play this game far harder than you can. And we are willing to do far more than you are willing to go. And if you want to continue this into a war, we'll fight that war and we'll win it. And so that's what resulted in Soleimani being taken out. The Iranians responded in half measure because they knew that they could not win a war of escalation. In military terms, this is called escalate to de-escalate. That we knew that we could escalate further than the Iranians could, and that would de-escalate the chain of tensions, which is exactly what happened. The Iranians ultimately backed down. I think the Iranians realized they did more than they could. They still seek to revenge Soleimani. They are still trying to assassinate U.S. officials, current and former U.S. Government officials on U.S. soil. So they don't view this book as entirely closed.
I'm wondering about that. I mean, I know that obviously you're right, and I wrote about it as well in Israel Hayom last week. But the thing that I'm wondering about there as well is the absence of U.S. deterrence, right? I mean, that it came out in the Washington Examiner last week that John Bolton is now under Secret Service protection, and that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps officers who are behind the plot to assassinate Bolton in Washington, D.C., are known, their identities are known, and that the administration has chosen not to indict them, not to file open indictments against them, because they don't want to anger the Iranians during the nuclear talks in Vienna. And, this is, I think I wrote on my Twitter feed earlier today that I think that this is the fourth act of war that Iran has carried out against the United States in the last several weeks. There was the attack on U.S. forces in Tamf in Syria, the attack on U.S. forces in the UAE, the assassination attempts or plots against Bolton and Pompeo, both of them being protected now as by the Secret Service. And then you have the attack in Erbil, Iraq, on between Sunday and Monday of this week, and the response of the Biden administration: oh, well, we don't think that it was against us. We think it was against Israel. And anyway, it never really happened, and we don't really care. And what's really most important is to give them a nuclear deal and end sanctions restrictions on them. So you have this Biden administration that is just lying down and taking it from the Iranians. Why shouldn't they? I mean, if the U.S. were more serious, you think that the Iranian threats against former senior U.S. officials would be so serious?
I think if we had messaged them a clear and articulate consequence for what the death of a U.S. official would result, I think you would see the Iranians back down. If we said, look, if you assassinate these people, we will take out every single IRGC general. We will respond fivefold fashion. We will dismantle, everything that you have built. I think they would say, okay, that's not worth it. And that's the decision calculus that you have to make. That's why we took out Soleimani.
That's escalating to de-escalate.
That's escalating to what's going to happen. Saying that we can, look, you might be able to take out one of our guys, but we can take out all of yours, and we're willing to do it. And that message needs to be sent, and I don't believe it's been sent.
All right, I want to get to Russia at the end of our discussion, but before we do, I want to talk to you a second about the uranium enrichment and the JCPOA that enabled Iran to develop advanced centrifuges under the aegis of the deal. The Israeli government and Democrats and the Biden administration all fault the Trump administration. They say, see, look, because you left the deal, or they fault the Netanyahu government because they said, because you were working so hard and lobbied so hard for Trump to leave the JCPOA. So both sides are being attacked. Iran began doing the enrichment in the advanced centrifuges to 60%. And what my friend and colleague David Wormser explains about this, and I'd like to get your view of it, is that, well, That's not true, because the Iranians always agreed to things that place limits on what they could do at that moment. Going back to the Bush administration, when he was involved in the negotiations with the Iranians on various things, so that when they got to they had the ability to enrich to 3.67, and they said, okay, you can take some of our stockpiles, but in exchange, we're going to develop the means to enrich to 60% purity of our uranium, so that they developed these advanced centrifuges, and they started using them as soon as they were ready to 60%, and that was when they started doing it, regardless of what they had agreed to in the JCPOA. And I think that that point is very key. And the question whether you guys saw it as such as well, or whether you blamed yourself when the Iranians pulled out the advanced centrifuges and began enriching. I mean, how did you view that? Did you think that that was a fault of your policies?
I don't, well, fault is a word I don't usually use. I would say it was a natural response from Iran. Frankly, I'm surprised that Iran took a year to enrich at all after we withdrew from the deal. I would have imagined Iran would have wanted to enrich sooner.
Well, probably they didn't have I mean, I think that the Wormser argument is that they didn't have the means to do so, because the enriched went at the moment that they had the centrifuges that were advanced and capable of, enriching uranium at 10 times the pace and at 20 times the enrichment levels. That's when they went and used them.
So yeah, I probably disagree slightly with his analysis. My take on it is, one, Iran thought that the consequences of the U.S. withdrawing from the deal wouldn't be significant. They thought that they wouldn't be able to take much Iranian oil off the market. They thought that the Europeans would develop this instex method to bypass U.S. sanctions, which didn't work. And they thought that Trump wasn't really serious about a lot of this, that a lot of it was just rhetoric. That's why I don't think they enriched much the first year. What they wanted to do, and what they did is they did this where they said, every 60 days, we will take a further small incremental step of nuclear enrichment. So at first they moved it to 4.5% enrichment. Then it was 5%. Then it was 10%.
And you don't think that they would have done any of this if the United States had remained in the nuclear deal?
No, because my view is the Iranians understand that the JCPOA is a sweetheart deal for them. It's a deal where the time is all on their side. They get to escalate all their nuclear enrichment timelines over time to their benefit. And so all they have to do is wait out the US and over time to take these actions. They didn't take the 60%, they didn't start enriching to 60% until Biden took office in January 2021 is when they first started enriching at 60%.
So what does that tell you?
That tells me that they wanted to use each act of enrichment as pressure for diplomacy, specifically pressure, sorry, I'm about to sneeze again, pressure for the Europeans to place pressure on us, pressure for the media and Democrats to sort of raise the alarm about it. Again, both the CIA and the Israeli intelligence services have indicated that Iran has not taken weaponization acts to weaponize their nuclear program. What that tells me is they are not seeking right now a nuclear weapon. They are seeking nuclear leverage, not a nuclear weapon today. Otherwise, they'd be taking weaponization. They'd be embarking on steps of weaponizing their nuclear program. The reason they haven't done so is because they rightly fear the military consequences from the U.S. and, more importantly, from Israel.
But I have to admit that I disagree with you on your assessment. And the reason that I disagree with you on your assessment is because I think that the fact that they began enriching to 60% when Biden came in was a statement of contempt for Biden. And it wasn't, and I also think that it's very odd, given the timeline of the enrichment, that anybody would cast aspersions at the maximum pressure campaign and claim that it was responsible. Because again, it's a question of seriousness of purpose. And the Iranians clearly have Biden's number, have Mali's number, and they don't think that they have anything to fear, so they might as well go ahead and do it.
So the one I think I don't disagree with your analysis. I think for me the leading indicators are more timing on their end. One thing that I think a lot about is that the difference between 20% enrichment and 60% enrichment is really not that much. By the time you've enriched to 20% uranium purity, you've done, I believe, 93 to 95% of the work to get to weapons grade. Going from 20% to 60% is only doing about 2 to 3% more work towards that 100%. Because once you've removed going from 3.67% to 20% is removing a huge amount of the impure material. Going the rest of the way is a lot easier. So I don't see 60% as a particularly. I saw the move to 20% as a lot more escalatory than I saw the move to 60% is indeed further escalatory from 20%, but it's a different degree.
So I guess but it sounds scary, right? 60%. It sounds very scary.
And that is precisely what they wanted to achieve. They wanted a very scary sounding headline, which they got.
But I don't. I mean, you. All right, let's just leave this for a second. I want to go to Russia because we don't have a lot more time, and I do want to hit this as well. So, Russia. You wrote in your tweet that Ulyanov is essentially running the negotiations. Can you give a little bit of background on what you mean by that?
So, first of all, you have the U.S. and the Iranians aren't in the same room together. They have messages ferried from both the E3
because the Iranians refused to sit in a room with the Americans.
Correct, and so the Russians have for a long time been Iran's political guardians.
Although I have to say there was a report by the former Israeli National Security advisor Yaakov Amidor, who said that his sources claim that Mali is frequently meeting with the head of the Iranian delegation and just the two of them in rooms, and that they are negotiating directly. So I would say that I did hear that report.
That wouldn't surprise me. Frankly, that doesn't surprise me. I don't know it firsthand, but that I wouldn't be surprised by that.
At any rate, Ulyanov.
At any rate, the Russians have long been sort of Iran's political patrons, and they are there to represent Iran's interests within the non-Iran negotiating meeting. So yes, the E3 will ferry messages, but the Russians are there to provide, the power and the convincing and being the sort of the bad cop for the negotiations and carrying Iran's water here in the negotiations. That has been true until the very end, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine has completely changed the negotiating calculus and incentive structure for the parties here at the agreement. Now it's a little bit more antagonistic because Russia's interests are somewhat in conflict with Iran's interests. But even if you look at the public side, Ulyanov was the only one posting pictures and readouts of most of the negotiations. He's been self-advertising as the public face of these negotiations the whole time.
Well, you can't have a deal without Russia. So that, he does have an awfully strong negotiating position. The idea that the United States is now saying, the U.S. just said, I think yesterday, and also they reinstated it today, the Biden administration, that if the Russians try to, if the Russians block the deal, then we're going to do another deal without them. But that assumes that the Chinese are going to go along with that, and the whole thing is just completely ignoring the fact that Russia and China and Iran are all working together here. So, It's like the Americans, even now when they're in the negotiations, they're failing to recognize the nature of the forces that they're negotiating with, that China and Russia and Iran are one team.
Exactly.
They have different interests, but they are one team.
And the Russian ambassador admitted this in a very revealing interview with IRNA News, which is the Iranian state media. He admitted that they were working together in these negotiations for Iran's benefit. Now, I think it is possible to have a deal without without Russia. Russia is there primarily for work with Iran's nuclear program. They do a lot at Bushehr. Nuclear facility.
They built Bushehr. Bushehr is Russian.
But it is possible in theory that the French could remove Iran's nuclear enriched material. There are other countries that have that ability, but it would take ages to rejigger this deal and redo it without Russia, and that would require Iran to basically suspend its current nuclear enrichment. Otherwise, they would trigger what the United States alleges is this political timeline or technical timeline, which would cause them to leave.
Yeah, we can see Iran doing that, especially since Russia is the guarantor of the survival of Bashar al-Assad, and Iran has really evinced great interest in allowing Bashar al-Assad to fall. So no, I mean, their interests are so entwined, their strategic interests are so vastly, their shared interests, their shared goals are so vast.
Exactly.
It's absurd.
So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next week or so. Fortunately, the U.S. has indicated they're not willing to entertain Russian demands. But look, as I told you,
how long do you think that's going to last for, though? I mean, this deal, it's like, what's his name said, Obama's Spinmeister, Ben Rhodes. I mean, he said this is the most important foreign policy initiative this is the most important initiative of Obama's second term, when he was talking about the JCPOA. I mean, this is basically the only foreign policy initiative of Biden's term, right? I mean, they're not going to let this go away. They need Russia, and that really calls into question their entire Ukraine operation, because if Russia is going to make this impossible for them to go forward with the Iran nuclear deal, then, I mean, they're being forced to choose between their Ukraine policy and their Iran policy. Which one do you think that they're going to hold more important, of higher value for them?
Look, I think if Russia said, hey, this is this or nothing, and the Iranians said, we're with Russia here, it's all or nothing, that would put the Biden administration in this incredibly difficult position, because the American people don't usually care about foreign policy. They don't usually pay attention, but they are paying attention on Russia, Ukraine right now. They're paying a huge amount of attention to it. And if they saw the U.S., cave to Russia on Iran, they would then suddenly start paying a whole lot of attention to this Iran deal. And already what I've seen is a huge backlash in Congress and in the public against this Russian negotiated deal. I think the Biden administration is being forced into this very uncomfortable corner where everything it is doing right now on Iran is highly politically flammable for them. It's not going to result in even Democrats in Congress recognize that this deal is far worse. Senator Chris Murphy actually quote tweeted my piece in Tablet, and he admitted that this deal is not going to be as good as the old deal, and he blamed Trump for that, and said, look, we're not going to get a deal that's better. That's just not what's going to happen. And so I think you're not going to see even Democrat members of Congress really defend this deal. They might say it is necessary, but they will not say that it's a good deal. They would not claim that.
All right, last question that I'm going to ask you then, because we have to wrap it up. But what do you think the chances are that Biden is going to submit this to Congress? And do you think that there's any appetite for the agreement to be deliberated or approved among Democrats in the Senate?
So my understanding, and this is a little loose, is that he's not going to submit it the proper way. He might submit it in an improper way as a sort of veneer of seeking for congressional.
What does that mean?
So normally, the moment that you get a deal, you have 5 days to submit to Congress, and then you have a 30-day window where you cannot have any sanctions released. You cannot, change any sanctions on Iran unilaterally. You have to wait for Congress to act. My understanding is that President Biden is going to lift sanctions anyways in this first tranche that could happen any day. And then after that, there are a couple other sort of portions of the deal which he might submit those parts to Congress. And so
wait, that the first tranche involves unfreezing
that would be ending all
sanctions.
That would be lifting sanctions on all of the Supreme Leader's office.
That's just canceling Trump's executive order, which he's fully able to do as president. So that
he can do that as president, but the law says that if he does that pursuant to a nuclear deal with Iran, that deal has to be submitted to Congress and has 30 days before it can take effect. So that is where he would be breaking the law, is by he has authority to rescind those sanctions, but he must do that pursuant to submitting a deal with Congress. So it's possible that he will submit portions of the deal later to Congress, but damage will have already been done because not all, but a large portion of those funds, the 90 billion, would be accessible by Iran in the interim before Congress can act.
So that's interesting. That would actually, since that could clearly be defined as a high crime, right? I mean, that if the Republicans take over in January 2023, they could impeach Biden for that.
They could. I mean, you can impeach the president for about anything that is ultimately a political.
As we discovered twice with Trump. Yeah.
As we've discovered, impeachment is a purely political endeavor. It is the judgment of any member of Congress whether any action constitutes a high crime or misdemeanor. And so it's up to the discretion of each member of Congress on that question. In terms of will it get a vote? Probably not. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer appear to be sort of carrying President Biden's water on this. So even if a deal is submitted to Congress, it is not guaranteed a vote. All that is guaranteed is that members can review the deal, but an actual vote is the discretion of both Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi in the Senate and House, respectively. So it is. So frankly, and even if there were a vote, President Biden would be able to veto any resolution of disapproval. So ultimately, there's accountability that Congress can provide, but only with a 2/3 majority of both chambers could Congress actually act to block it. What Congress's primary
that's under the INARA. That's under the INARA.
That's under INARA. Now,
INARA stood the Constitution on its head, right? Because I mean, you're supposed to have a 2/3 passage. You're supposed to have 2/3 majority to pass a treaty, and they pretended that they did something else. So, I mean, in a way, I guess we should probably wrap it up. But what you're saying is that Biden, through Malley, is negotiating a surrender to Iran, and the Congress under Biden's cronies, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, are going to stand the Constitution on its head and pretend that this isn't something that requires congressional or Senate approval and ratification as a treaty. So, great. Great.
Thank you. I think you hit about it.
I guess what I wanted to say, the parallel that I wanted to make was that they're going to sign this deal that puts the nuclear non-proliferation treaty in the garbage can, and Chuck and Nancy are going to then throw the Constitution in the garbage can by not subjecting it to any formal congressional oversight or approval as a treaty. So
that's my fear. That's my fear as well.
That's terrific. All right. Well, on that happy note, it was very nice meeting you on this podcast, on this webcast. I thank you for exposing the details of this very distressing deal. Do you think, by the way, just I guess one last question, you think that the Russian machinations may push this back and make it delay it enough to make it irrelevant?
That is my hope, combined with a very, very large outcry from Congress in the last week, largely as a result, if I'm not being too bold, as from my reporting, there's been a huge outcry from Congress about the details that were leaked. And so I think there is a real chance that this could collectively tank the deal. I hope that's the case. I fear it's not the case, but hope springs eternal.
Well, I think it's important. I think that you really do deserve a lot of credit for having friends in the right places and having friends who turn to you to expose this information, because it's certainly critical that that Congress know this, that Israel know this, that the Saudis and the UAE know this, and that we can all, at a minimum, be more prepared when this horrible deal is concluded. And I think that, there's the truth is the greatest disinfectant, and I think it's very important, and really you deserve a lot of credit for getting it out. And so I want to say thank you for the great work that you're doing. And thank you for joining us on the podcast today. We'll have to have you back the next time that you break a major story about the inner workings of the Biden pro-Iran factory in the State Department and in the administration more generally. I appreciate it very much. Guys, so thank you very much for watching this newest episode. I think we're going to be talking with Tony Badran about Syria and Lebanon next week, so stay tuned for that also, and make sure that you get the word out to all of your friends and nodding acquaintances. We passed the 4,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I saw that Rumble is now outpacing YouTube suddenly in 2 weeks, 2-1. So that's all great. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, and we'll see you again next week. Oh, and happy Purim to everybody, and may we see the new Haman of our times, Khamenei and the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian regime overturned like Haman back in the day, and we should rejoice when the Iranian people are free and we're free of the Iranian regime. So that's that. Signing off for this week. Take care.